Every night, Marcus stepped through the doors of the high-rise corporate building, the weight of his cleaning supplies in hand, and a quiet determination in his stride. The city outside was alive with the rush of commuters and the neon glow of late-night traffic, but inside the building, the air was still, filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant buzz of air conditioning. Marcus had worked here for years, as the night shift cleaner, his role vital, though often unseen. He wasn't bothered by the anonymity of it. He had learned long ago that the value of hard work wasn't measured by how many people saw it but by how well it was done. Each evening, as he made his rounds, he treated the polished floors, gleaming windows, and empty cubicles with the utmost respect. His movements were precise and practiced, the cleaning supplies he carried a testament to the care he put into every task. He knew this building like the back of his hand, the way the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air even when the office was empty, the specific click of the elevator doors as they opened for him, and the way the lights flickered in the conference rooms when no one was around. There was something almost sacred about the silence at night, the calm after a day of frantic meetings, tight deadlines, and endless phone calls. To Marcus, it was a space for reflection, a moment of peace where he could be alone with his thoughts, free from the noise of the world outside. He wasn't a man of many words, but in the stillness of these late-night hours, he found clarity in the rhythm of his work. He had come from a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, where the noise of the streets often drowned out any chance of quiet reflection. His journey had not been easy, years of laboring long hours at low-paying jobs, always trying to make ends meet, always striving for a better life. But he had built a routine. A routine that grounded him, gave him purpose, and filled him with a sense of pride that he hadn't expected when he first started out. His role, though it didn't carry the prestige of the corporate executives who worked in the same building, was important. The cleanliness of the space mattered. The way the floors shined, the desks remained organized, the windows were spotless. These details were not insignificant to Marcus. His hands may have been the ones that scrubbed away the grime, but his heart was in every swipe of the mop, every wipe of the glass. His work spoke of dignity, of the pride he took in doing something well, even if no one noticed. And yet, every evening, just as the clock struck the hour for him to begin his shift, he would see her, Anna, the woman who worked late into the night. She was the marketing manager, always the last to leave, her eyes tired but determined, her shoulders slumped from long hours at the computer. Their interactions were brief, professional. Marcus would offer a quiet good evening as she passed, and she would nod, offering a polite smile, her gaze never lingering. There was a distance between them, a line drawn by the simple fact that she was part of the world he had long observed from the edges. He didn't mind. He understood the divide between their worlds. He knew what it meant to be invisible, to be the person who was seen only when something was out of place, but he had made peace with that. He didn't expect anything more from their interactions. She was part of the corporate machine, the world that he worked in but never fully belonged to. Still, he couldn't help but notice the way her tired eyes would meet his briefly, the silent acknowledgement of their shared space in that stillness. They were both workers, in their own way, both committed to getting the job done, no matter how exhausting it was. Sometimes, on the rare occasion that they shared a few moments in passing, Marcus would wonder if she ever noticed the hours he put in, the way he made sure the floors were polished to perfection, or the way the bathrooms were always spotless when she arrived in the morning. But he didn't dwell on it. His pride didn't come from recognition, it came from knowing that his work had value. As the months passed, the routine never changed. The building remained quiet at night, and Marcus continued his work with the same quiet resolve that had always guided him. The job was hard, sometimes exhausting, but he found a certain peace in it. He had learned to live with the weight of his dreams, the hopes of a better future for his family, the quiet pride of a man who did his job well, even if no one else acknowledged it. One night, as he finished mopping the hallway near Anna's office, she stopped in front of him, her tired expression softened by a weary smile. "You do a great job," she said, her voice low but sincere. Marcus was taken aback by the words, but he nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied quietly. It was a small gesture, one that didn't change the course of his life, but in that moment, it felt like a reminder that his work mattered, even if it wasn't always acknowledged. The routine continued the next night and the next, each day blending into the next, but that brief exchange stayed with him. He realized that, in some way, their brief interactions had become a silent acknowledgement of their shared struggles, the long hours, the hard work, the quiet persistence. They were both just trying to make it, in a world that often overlooked people like them. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt seen. Not for the work he did, but for the man he was. Eleanor sat at her desk, her eyes scanning the paperwork spread out before her, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating the sharp angles of her face, the quiet hum of the office after hours creating a rhythm that had become familiar. As the office manager, she had spent years building a reputation for efficiency, precision, and control. She was the backbone of the company, the one who ensured everything ran smoothly, even when the weight of responsibility seemed unbearable. Her colleagues respected her, even admired her, but she remained somewhat of an enigma. While she had earned the trust of every department head and worked tirelessly to meet every deadline, there was always a distance in her demeanor, a boundary she kept firmly in place. She didn't engage in idle office chatter, never joined in the after-work drinks, and often left before anyone could ask how she was doing. Her role in the office had become her identity, a role she played with exceptional skill, but it left little room for anything else. Beneath the surface of her confidence, however, there was a quiet exhaustion, a weariness that clung to her like a second skin. Eleanor's work was everything, her validation, her purpose, but it came with a price. Each night, as the office slowly emptied out, she would stay behind, meticulously sifting through the never-ending piles of reports, budgets, and meeting notes. The paperwork would never end, and she knew it. The demands of her job had a way of consuming her, of making her feel like she was constantly chasing something just out of reach. Her sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to her work made her an invaluable asset to the company, but it also isolated her. She often found herself alone in the quiet of the office, the low murmur of the city outside her window the only sound to accompany her as she worked late into the evening. She would often look out over the cityscape, wondering how much of her life had been consumed by the pursuit of professional success, how many moments she had missed in her personal life. But these thoughts were fleeting. There was always more work to be done. As she adjusted her glasses and leaned in closer to the papers, she didn't notice him. Paul, the office janitor, was finishing up his rounds. He had seen her this way many times, staying late, always absorbed in her tasks, her focus unshakable. While their interactions had always been brief and polite, Paul couldn't help but admire her quiet strength. It wasn't just her intellect that impressed him, though that was evident to anyone who worked with her. It was the way she carried herself, the way she handled the pressure, the way she never allowed her emotions to show. She was a force to be reckoned with, and though he was just the janitor, he felt a strange sense of pride in witnessing her drive, in knowing that she was the one who made everything in the office come together. He had seen her in the hallways, walking briskly with a file under her arm, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She moved with purpose, her head held high, and yet there was always something almost distant in her gaze, as though she was somewhere else lost in her own world. Paul had worked in the building for years, and though their interactions were limited to the brief exchanges of good morning or thank you when she passed him in the hallway, he had developed a quiet respect for her. She was a woman of few words, but her actions spoke volumes. As he cleaned the floors in the quiet, nearly empty office, he couldn't help but notice the way she would still be there, late into the evening, long after everyone else had gone home. She never seemed to need a break, never seemed to pause to consider whether it was okay to leave. There was a part of him that wanted to ask her if she was okay, if she ever allowed herself to breathe, but he didn't. He knew it wasn't his place. Still, there was something in the way she carried herself, in the quiet intensity of her focus, that made him wonder what lay beyond the walls she had built around herself. What made her so driven? Did she feel the weight of it, the pressure that came with always being the one others relied on, the one who never faltered? The sound of her tapping keys on her keyboard and the rustling of papers became a rhythmic backdrop as he finished his work, quietly pushing the mop across the floor. He glanced over at her desk, watching her for a moment longer, the exhaustion in her posture something he could sense even if she didn't show it. He had seen her go through the motions of her day, greeting others with a smile, answering emails, attending meetings, and yet, it was clear to him that this was not enough. She gave so much of herself to her work, but in return, she asked for little. He knew she probably didn't realize it, but in that brief moment of reflection, Paul saw the complexity of the woman she was, someone whose quiet strength and leadership were matched only by the loneliness that seemed to come with it. As he turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel that there was more to Eleanor than she let the world see. He didn't know her story, but he hoped that one day, she would allow herself the chance to let go, to ask for help when she needed it, to recognize that even someone as strong as her deserved a moment of peace. Every day, the man watched her from the corner of the room, his eyes lingering just a little longer than they should, though he never dared to make his admiration known. He held a position often seen as menial by those around him, a role that required the kind of humility that, to some, felt like a shackle. His job was often relegated to the shadows, the quiet tasks behind the scenes that no one noticed unless they went wrong. And yet, there was a quiet pride in the way he approached his work, the meticulous attention he gave to every detail, the way he carried himself even when the world seemed to overlook him. He knew his role, and while it might not have been glamorous or celebrated, it was his, and he did it with a dignity that only a few could truly appreciate. But what truly captivated him, what made him look up from his tasks again and again, was the woman. She was a force so different from him in stature, in position, in the way people saw her. She commanded respect effortlessly, her confidence in every step, every decision, every glance. He had watched her rise through the ranks, fighting battles, overcoming obstacles, and always maintaining a poise that seemed almost otherworldly. He could see the weight of her responsibilities, the way her shoulders sometimes sagged when she thought no one was watching, but she never let that weakness show. There was an elegance to her strength, a grace in the way she held herself under pressure that made his heart swell with admiration. More than anything, he was struck by the way she carried herself, the way she inspired those around her. He saw the way people listened when she spoke, the way they followed her lead without question. He was well aware that this wasn't something that came easily to most people, especially people like him, who had spent their entire lives in the background, never asked to lead, never entrusted with the kinds of decisions that could change lives. He had often wondered what it would feel like, just for a moment, to sit in her chair, to be the one in charge, to make decisions that shape the future. What would it feel like to command a room with just a word, to have people look to him for direction, to know that his choices mattered? These thoughts were fleeting, quickly pushed away by the reality of his place in the world, but still, they lingered, like a soft whisper at the edge of his mind. He knew his role, and he knew hers, and the gap between them felt as vast as an ocean. But even with that knowledge, even with the understanding that they lived in two very different worlds, he couldn't help but admire her. There was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself, something he hadn't seen in anyone else. He admired her strength, her ability to remain calm under pressure, her ability to take charge when others faltered. He admired the way she carried the weight of her position, never letting the cracks show, never letting anyone see how hard it was to be the one others relied on. And as he watched her from afar, he often caught himself wondering what it would be like to live in her shoes, to know what it was like to have that kind of power, that kind of influence. Yet, as much as these thoughts surfaced, he always pushed them away, always reminded himself of his place. He knew he was not meant to be in that world, not meant to lead or to make the decisions that shaped the course of events. He was here to support, to do the work that others didn't see, to be the foundation upon which the higher ups built their success. That was his purpose, and though he sometimes wished for more, he had learned to accept that some people were meant to be the quiet, steady hands behind the scenes, while others were meant to stand in the spotlight. But there was something in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she lived her life with such quiet determination that made him believe, for just a moment, that maybe she saw something in him, too. Maybe she saw the same quiet strength in him that he saw in her. But he would never ask. He would never let her know the depths of his admiration, the thoughts that spiraled in his mind when he saw her working late into the night, when he saw her carrying the burdens that she refused to let anyone else carry. She was a symbol of everything he aspired to be, and yet he knew he could never reach her level. Still, there was a sense of peace in knowing that he could be a part of her world, even if only from the periphery, even if he would always remain in the background, supporting her from a distance. He knew his place, and he accepted it, because in his quiet corner of the world, he could still admire her, could still find inspiration in her strength, her grace, her quiet power. That, he thought, was enough. The hum of the office was muted by the soft shuffle of footsteps as Marcus, the janitor, made his way to the corner of the room near Sarah's desk. It was late, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows against the polished floors as the usual bustle of the day had long since faded into quiet. The rhythm of his cleaning supplies, cloth against wood, mop against tile, was almost meditative, a way to unwind after the hours spent in the back offices, away from the higher ups and their busy work. He didn't think much of it as he moved through the motions, his eyes mostly on the ground, focused on the task at hand. But something was different this time. A shift in the air, subtle yet undeniable, made him pause for just a moment. Sarah, the senior executive who worked tirelessly into the evening, sat in her usual spot at her desk, her eyes scanning the endless stream of reports in front of her, the weight of her responsibilities evident in her furrowed brow. She had always been distant, never sparing more than a brief nod or passing acknowledgement to him whenever he came through to tidy up the office at the end of the day. There was a boundary, clear and unspoken, between them, a professional distance that had never been breached. But tonight, as Marcus methodically wiped down the desk nearest to Sarah's, he noticed that she wasn't just focused on her work anymore. Her eyes, tired but sharp, lifted from the pile of papers in front of her and met his. For the first time, there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't cold, like it usually was. It wasn't dismissive or uninterested. No, tonight, there was a subtle softness there, a quiet curiosity. Sarah studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before something flickered in her eyes, and to his surprise, she smiled. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement of her lips, but it held a warmth that Marcus had never seen from her in all the years of working here. He froze, the mop still in his hand, unsure of what to make of the gesture. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't used to her noticing him like this, let alone acknowledging him with a smile. She leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence with words that hung in the air like a spark about to ignite. "Can we start right here?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, her tone inviting in a way that caught him off guard. The request itself was simple, almost casual, yet it carried an undercurrent of something more. Her words, laced with an unexpected vulnerability, shook him out of his reverie. They weren't directed at the work they had been doing for years, the clean lines of their respective roles, but at something deeper, something unspoken between them. Marcus's mind raced, his pulse quickening as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't just another interaction between an employee and the person who held the keys to the office. This was different, something charged with a quiet intensity he hadn't anticipated. Her words made the air seem heavier, more loaded with meaning than it had ever been before. The delicate balance that had always existed between them, the invisible line of separation between worker and boss, suddenly felt blurred, no longer so rigid or defined. He had always kept his distance, never allowing himself to look too long at Sarah, never allowing himself to feel anything more than the professional respect he owed her as his superior. She had always been above him in every sense: her sharp business acumen, her effortless grace under pressure, her authority over the very space they occupied. He was just the janitor, the one who cleaned up after the work was done. But now, as he looked at her, there was an unexpected invitation in her gaze, a pull that he couldn't ignore. The power dynamics, so firmly entrenched and unquestioned for so long, were starting to shift. There was no longer a clear line between them, no longer the same professional distance that had always defined their interactions. In this quiet moment, something had changed. Sarah's eyes held his a moment longer than he was comfortable with, as though she were waiting for a response, as though the weight of the moment hinged on what he would say next. Marcus cleared his throat, feeling the awkwardness of the situation settle between them like a fog. He was no longer just cleaning the space around her. He was present in a way that felt different, more intimate, as though the very act of him being there was something that carried meaning. He wiped his palms on his uniform, unsure of how to answer. "Right here?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual, betraying the uncertainty inside him. She nodded, her smile still there, but now with a flicker of something else, perhaps a challenge, or perhaps an invitation to step into a new, uncharted space between them. The tension in the room thickened, stretching between them as they both stood at the precipice of something neither of them could fully understand yet. It wasn't just a question about where to start. This was about power, about control, about boundaries that had once been clearly drawn, now beginning to blur. As Sarah's eyes softened, and as Marcus felt that surge of something stirring within him, he realized that this moment, so small and simple on the surface, was charged with the potential to change everything between them. No longer would they remain in the roles that had always defined their relationship. The space they had shared for so long was no longer just a room, it was a threshold, and they were both standing at the edge, unsure of what lay beyond. The room was quiet, the air thick with tension as the woman sat across from the man, her posture poised and unyielding. Her eyes, steady and confident, met his, and she could see the flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, the way his hands fidgeted on the desk in front of him. For so long, he had been the one in control, the one whose decisions shaped the course of their work, their collaboration. He had always been the one who set the pace, the one who defined the parameters. But now, something had shifted. She was no longer the passive participant, the one who waited for instructions. She had taken a different stance, one that spoke volumes without a single word. Her body language was deliberate, a slight adjustment in her chair, the crossing of her legs, a subtle yet inviting gesture that opened the door for something more. It was an invitation, not an imposition. Her confidence radiated from her as she sat back, relaxed yet commanding, and for the first time, the man saw her not just as a colleague but as someone whose presence he could no longer dismiss. The shift in the room was palpable, like a slow, simmering change in the air that threatened to crack the walls of their carefully constructed professional dynamic. She had always been competent, sharp, and driven, but it was in this moment, this quiet, confident assertion, that she allowed herself to reveal a part of herself he hadn't seen before, her power to shape the situation, to redirect the course of their interaction. The man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to gauge her intentions. He had expected her to ask, to make a demand, to present a problem that needed solving. But instead, she spoke in a tone that was both calm and assertive, her words cutting through the space between them like a thread pulling them closer. "Can we start right here?" she asked, the question simple but laced with significance. The way she spoke was not just a suggestion, it was an invitation to a new approach, to a new understanding of their relationship. It was a call for him to step away from the rigid formality that had governed their interactions and engage with her in a way that was more open, more collaborative, more real. The words hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning, and the man felt his breath catch. It wasn't an order, not a demand or an ultimatum, but an invitation to connect with her in a way he had never done before. There was a quiet power in her voice, a calmness that didn't need to raise itself above the noise to be heard. She wasn't looking for his approval, she was offering him an opportunity. An opportunity to engage in something different, something more meaningful. The subtle shift in her tone, the way her eyes softened yet remained unwavering, spoke to a deeper level of trust. She wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, to step beyond the boundaries that had kept them in separate spheres. She had decided that it was time for them to break free from the walls of formality, to see each other as equals, as partners, as two people who could contribute something meaningful to the conversation, without the weight of hierarchy pressing down on them. For a moment, the man didn't know how to respond. He was so accustomed to being the one who made decisions, the one who had the final say, that the idea of being invited into something less defined, less controlled, threw him off balance. He had spent years building his career, his reputation, by maintaining order and structure, by keeping things compartmentalized and predictable. But here, now, with her calm, unwavering presence before him, he was faced with the unfamiliar. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that their connection didn't have to be confined to the roles they had always played. She had just given him a choice, to stay within the boundaries of what he knew, or to step outside of them, to engage with her in a new, more open way. It was a subtle challenge, a quiet call to authenticity, and it unsettled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The walls he had built around his professional self began to feel constricting, limiting. He had spent so long defining himself by his work, by his role, that he hadn't noticed how much it had isolated him. But there, in front of him, was a woman who didn't need the walls. She didn't need the formality. She simply needed the space to be seen, to be heard, and to engage on her own terms. And now, for the first time, she was offering him that same space. She wasn't waiting for him to take the first step, she had already taken it for him. The shift in the dynamic was subtle, but it was undeniable. It was a small, yet significant act of rebellion against the norms that had governed their relationship, a quiet assertion of her own voice and power. As the man sat back in his chair, considering her words, he felt something stir within him, a sense of possibility, of opening up to something different. He had spent so long running the show, holding the reins, that he hadn't realized how stifling it could be. Now, as her gaze remained steady on him, he realized that the invitation she had offered wasn't just about their professional relationship, it was about the space between them, the potential for something deeper, something more real. For the first time in their interactions, the man felt himself at a crossroads. He could retreat into the familiar, or he could step forward and embrace the possibility of something more authentic. The decision, he realized, was his. And as he looked at her, her poised confidence, her unwavering belief in her own worth, he knew that whatever choice he made, it would change everything. The room was still, the air heavy with anticipation, as he stood frozen, unsure how to react to her words. Her voice had just broken through the silence, unexpected, direct, and charged with meaning. His heart raced in his chest, a rush of adrenaline making his thoughts scatter. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had always been so careful, so calculated, keeping his distance, never allowing himself to get too close, always knowing his place in the world. But now, her invitation, her words had upended everything he had worked so hard to maintain. His mind spun in circles, the sense of control slipping further from his grasp with each passing second. He glanced at her once, then quickly looked down at the floor, almost as though the act of looking away could steady his swirling thoughts. The floor seemed to offer no answers, only a dull, beige expanse that made him feel even more disconnected. His gaze flicked back to her, searching her face for a clue, a hint of what this moment truly meant. Was it a challenge? A test, perhaps? Was she daring him to be something more than he had allowed himself to be? Or was it simply an invitation, raw and unguarded, to step beyond the walls they had both so carefully built? A part of him felt the fear of the unknown surge within him, a hesitation to take a step into territory that had always been off limits. But another part of him, one that he rarely allowed to surface, felt an undeniable pull toward her, a curiosity that ignited like a small flame in his chest. There was something about her that seemed different, something in her eyes, in the calm assurance with which she had spoken, that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, this was real. Maybe this wasn't some game, some trick meant to push his buttons or test his resolve. Maybe it was a genuine opening, a chance to step out of the confines he had so carefully constructed for himself. The uncertainty gnawed at him, the unfamiliar weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't used to this, to feeling like the rules had suddenly changed, and he was standing in the middle of an unknown game with no clear understanding of how to play. He had always been the observer, the one who remained detached, analyzing the world from a distance. It had worked for him, this guarded life, this self-imposed isolation that kept his emotions at bay. But here she was, challenging everything he had built. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had been hiding from, how much he had kept locked away inside. He had prided himself on his control, his ability to stay composed, to never let anyone see the things that linger just beneath the surface. But her words had opened something in him, something he wasn't ready to confront yet, and it made him uneasy. He wanted to retreat, to pull back into the safety of his usual distance, but there was a part of him, a part that had never truly been allowed to grow, that wanted to take a step forward. He looked at her again, this time for longer, trying to read her expression, searching for any sign of what this moment really meant. Was she waiting for him to speak? To respond? Or was this simply her way of testing him, to see if he would rise to the occasion? His mind raced with possibilities, each one more confusing than the last. The room felt smaller, as though the four walls were closing in on him, making the air feel thick and suffocating. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so uncertain, so vulnerable. It was a feeling that terrified him, this lack of control, this uncertainty about what would come next. He had always prided himself on his ability to predict the outcome, to keep things from spiraling into unpredictability. But now, standing here, staring at her with her eyes full of something he couldn't quite name, he realized that the only thing he could be sure of was that everything had changed. He wondered, too, if this was something he could even allow himself to have. Connection, vulnerability, intimacy, these were not things he had ever been willing to let into his life. He had built his walls for a reason, after all. He had kept everyone at arm's length because letting anyone in could mean losing himself, losing the one thing that had always kept him grounded, control. But there was something in the way she spoke, something in the steady way she stood, that made him question all of that. Was it possible that, for once, he didn't have to be the one in control? That he could let go of his tight grip on everything, just for a moment, and see where this might lead? The room around him was a blur now, his thoughts swirling, the walls closing in until it was just him and her. And in that stillness, he realized that whatever he chose to do next, whatever direction he decided to take, would change everything. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure which path to take. And that uncertainty, as unsettling as it was, felt strangely freeing. The man stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped the surface of the counter, though his thoughts were far from the task at hand. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and excitement, emotions that tangled together in a chaotic knot he couldn't untangle. He had always been in the background, invisible to most, performing his work quietly, efficiently, never once questioning his place in the world. But now, standing in the same room with her, someone he had always seen as distant, as unreachable, someone far above his station, he felt something shift within him. She had looked at him differently this time, not with the usual polite indifference, but with something more, something that made his heart race and his palms sweat. Was it curiosity? Compassion? Or something more? The thought echoed in his mind like a refrain, each beat driving him to a place of uncertainty. What did she want from him? Was she simply being kind, or was there something deeper, something he hadn't noticed before, something that might mean she saw him as more than just the cleaner? His breath hitched as he replayed the brief interaction over and over in his mind, unable to shake the feeling that this moment was something important, something he hadn't expected. Was she interested in him beyond a professional capacity? Could it be that she saw something in him that no one else had ever bothered to look for? The thought was absurd, almost laughable, but there it was, hanging in the air like a question he couldn't ignore. He had spent years living in the shadows, never daring to imagine that someone like her, a woman who moved through the world with confidence, grace, and authority, could see him as anything more than just a part of the background. Yet now, standing in her presence, he couldn't deny the pull he felt, the undeniable spark of connection that stirred something deep inside him, something he hadn't even known was there. His thoughts shifted, and he found himself wondering if this could be his moment, his opportunity to prove his worth, not just as a cleaner, but as someone who could be seen as an equal, someone who mattered beyond the labels and the roles society had placed on him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of possibility, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he had always believed. But then, just as quickly, a wave of doubt washed over him, and his excitement turned into fear. Could he truly stand beside her? Could he be more than the sum of his station, his position in life, the things that had defined him for so long? What if his hope was nothing more than a fantasy, an illusion he had conjured up in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to dream? He thought of the years he had spent cleaning floors and washing windows, the countless hours of work that had gone unnoticed, the way his presence had always been dismissed as insignificant. In all those years, he had never once considered the possibility of being seen in a different light, not by someone like her. And yet, now, in the space between uncertainty and desire, he felt the stirrings of something greater than he had ever known. His mind battled between the fear of rejection, the fear of misreading the signs, and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this moment could change everything. He longed to step forward, to say something, to reach out in a way that would shatter the walls of the roles they had both played for so long. But something held him back, an invisible force, a self-doubt that had been with him for as long as he could remember, telling him that someone like him could never belong in a world like hers. It wasn't just about status or position, it was about the deep-seated belief that he was meant to remain in the background, invisible and unheard, forever confined to the shadows. And yet, the pull he felt toward her, the way she had looked at him with that strange, unreadable expression, made him question everything. Could this be the moment when he was finally seen for who he was? Could he dare to believe that he was worthy of something more? His mind raced again, this time with the tension of possibility, the weight of fear, and the slow, steady realization that he might never get another chance like this. His hands shook as he held the rag tighter, unsure of what to do next, unsure of how to navigate the vast sea of emotions crashing through him. The room, once filled with the hum of routine, seemed to stand still, the air thick with the potential of what could be. In the silence, his internal conflict raged on, a battle between the man he had always been, the quiet, invisible worker, and the man he could become, if only he had the courage to step forward, to challenge the limits he had set for himself. Could he be more? Could he have a place in her world, not as a servant, not as someone defined by his job, but as someone with worth, with dignity, with the capacity for something greater? The question echoed in his mind as the moments stretched on, the weight of his internal conflict pressing down on him. And as he stood there, caught between uncertainty and longing, he couldn't help but wonder, could this be his chance to break free from the life he had always known and step into a future he had never imagined? In the quiet hum of the office, the tension between them was palpable, charged with an energy that neither of them had fully expected. Marcus stood just across from her, his back slightly stiff, his mind racing through 1,000 thoughts, but unable to focus on any of them. Laura, the woman he had admired from afar for months, was waiting, watching him with an intensity that felt both intimidating and oddly comforting. He could feel her gaze on him, sharp and unwavering, yet there was something in the way she tilted her head ever so slightly that told him she wasn't just waiting for him to respond, she was inviting him to step into something more. Her presence in the room was commanding, her posture straight and unyielding, every inch of her exuding control and authority. This was the woman who had built an empire within the company, the one everyone turned to when things were falling apart, the one whose decisions shaped the trajectory of every major project. Laura had always been the leader, the force that moved the office forward with precision and strength, and Marcus had always known his place, respectful, deferential, never daring to challenge the quiet power she wielded so effortlessly. But now, as they stood alone in her office, there was an unspoken shift, a subtle change in the dynamic between them. Laura leaned slightly forward, her eyes never leaving his, her expression unreadable yet somehow warm, the kind of warmth that invited trust. She was still the boss, still the unshakable force, but in this moment, something different flickered in her gaze, a vulnerability, an openness that made Marcus' heart race. It wasn't the kind of vulnerability one would expect from a woman who had mastered every room she walked into. It wasn't weakness, but rather the kind of quiet strength that allowed her to show a piece of herself that few had ever seen. The question she asked was simple, but it held a weight far beyond its words. "Do you think you're ready for what's next?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with an intent that felt like a challenge, a test of not just his professional readiness, but his willingness to rise to something greater than he'd ever imagined. The question seemed to hang in the air between them, making the very room feel electric, as though the space they occupied had become charged with possibility. Marcus swallowed hard, his mind momentarily blank as he tried to comprehend the depth of what she was asking. He had always seen Laura as a figure above him, a leader who seemed to have it all figured out, someone who never needed anyone's validation. And yet, in this moment, she was offering him something unexpected, a chance to prove himself, to step up, to be more than just an observer of her world. Her presence was commanding, yes, but it was also inviting, as though she was asking him to meet her on equal ground, to join her in the challenge that lay ahead. For a brief moment, Marcus saw something else in her eyes, not just the determination and control that had always defined her, but a quiet longing, the kind that came with the weight of expectation. It was as though she was searching for more than just his answer. She was searching for someone who could match her, someone who could understand the sacrifices she'd made to get where she was and stand beside her as an equal. In that moment, Marcus realized that Laura had never been just a leader to him, she had always been something more. She was a woman who had risen to power with grace and tenacity, who had built something incredible, but who had also carried the weight of that power in silence. And now, she was offering him a chance to share that weight, to face the challenges that came with it together. There was a quiet strength in her vulnerability, an openness that only made her more powerful in his eyes. The air between them crackled, thick with the promise of something greater, something he hadn't expected. Laura wasn't just asking if he was ready for the next step in his career, she was asking if he was ready to join her in the larger journey that was yet to unfold. Her question wasn't just a professional challenge, it was a moment of clarity for both of them, an unspoken invitation to bridge the gap between leader and follower, to step into a future where both of them could rise together. Marcus took a breath, his hesitation beginning to dissolve as he looked at her with newfound understanding. He had always respected her, admired her from a distance, but now, as he met her gaze, he realized that she wasn't just a figure to be revered from afar. She was a partner, someone who, in her own quiet way, had opened herself up to him, showing him that strength was not always about dominance or control, it could be about shared vulnerability, about asking for help when needed, about stepping forward with someone beside you. And as the seconds stretched into eternity, Marcus finally found his voice, a quiet but resolute yes, escaping his lips. In that single word, he knew that this was more than just a professional crossroads, it was a moment of connection, a shared understanding that would shape not only their futures but the future of everything they would build together. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound in the room as Thomas stood frozen, a cleaning bottle still clutched in his trembling hands, his once steadfast professional composure slipping away like sand through his fingers. The usual clink of mop against tile, the steady rhythm of his routine, All felt distant now, drowned out by the growing tension in the space between him and Sarah, whose gaze locked with his in a moment that seemed to stretch and bend time itself. She had been a constant in his life at work, an employee who never failed to meet expectations, a colleague whose presence in the office had always been both a comfort and a reminder of the boundaries they maintained. But today, something had shifted. The lines between boss and employee, authority and respect, were suddenly blurred, and neither of them knew what came next. He knew the moment had arrived, the moment that would define not just their professional relationship but something deeper, more personal, something neither of them had dared to acknowledge until now. His heart raced, the pulse in his ears a deafening drum beat that drowned out everything else. The task at hand, the work that was supposed to keep him grounded, now felt inconsequential, a hollow echo of the reality unfolding before him. It was her eyes, there was no avoiding the way she looked at him, as though she, too, had known this moment was inevitable, had sensed that something would finally crack between them. In that gaze, he saw a flicker of vulnerability, of uncertainty, but also an undeniable strength. The very essence of Sarah had always been rooted in self-assurance, and yet now, as the weight of the moment pressed down on both of them, she, too, stood on the precipice of something unknown. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his hands, but the quiver remained, a silent betrayer of his inner turmoil. This wasn't part of the script. In all his years of managing, of keeping a careful distance, he had never imagined this kind of confrontation, this kind of decision. He could feel the boundaries closing in around him, the expectations of his role as her supervisor, the unwritten rulebook of their professional lives, threatening to dictate his next move. And yet, in the depths of his hesitation, there was something else, a quiet voice, barely a whisper, urging him to step beyond the lines, to embrace the discomfort and uncertainty. He knew the risk. Stepping into this uncharted territory meant everything would change. There would be no going back to the way things had been. A decision would be made, and that decision would carry them both forward or pull them apart. It was a moment so fragile that every thought he had was heavy with consequence. But even as the rational side of him screamed to maintain control, to follow the rules and retreat to the safety of professionalism, something else inside him stirred, a sense of longing, of curiosity, of a possibility that he couldn't ignore. For the first time, he truly saw her, not just as a colleague, not just as someone he managed, but as a person standing on the same ground, both of them looking for something more. It was a recognition that wasn't born from attraction alone but from a deeper understanding, a shared humanity that had always been there but had been buried beneath layers of office protocol and guarded smiles. Sarah, sensing the change in him, didn't look away. Her eyes softened, and though there was still a hint of hesitation, there was no fear, only a quiet courage that mirrored his own. She hadn't spoken yet, but her presence was a question, a challenge. Without a word, she was asking him if he was willing to see beyond the roles they had played, if he was willing to venture into the unknown with her. The decision hung in the air, heavy and inevitable. Slowly, as if acknowledging the weight of the choice, Thomas took a step closer. His breath hitched, and for the briefest moment, time stood still. The cleaning bottle slipped from his fingers, forgotten. All that remained was the space between them, the electric charge that buzzed in the air. No words were needed, he could feel it in the way his heart pounded, in the way her posture subtly shifted. In that single, defining moment, he knew that sometimes, breaking the rules wasn't a sign of weakness or recklessness. It was the only way to discover what was truly possible, to explore the spaces that existed outside the lines. As he closed the distance between them, Thomas realized that this was not just a professional decision, it was an invitation to be vulnerable, to be real, to step into something uncertain with the one person who had, in a single glance, made him see the world differently. And so, with a final deep breath, he took the step. He stepped into the unknown, into the new dynamic that was waiting for both of them, a dynamic that would define them, change them, and perhaps, in time, lead them to a new understanding of what it meant to truly connect.